Hello, everyone. Hello to the panelists. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. And it's great to see all of you here. And thanks to Collision for having this talk, this most important talk today. First, thank you for the introduction. And with us all being Indigenous, each one of you panelists have very differing backgrounds in your professional lives. So let's start with you, Sheila. What does Indigenous digital sovereignty mean to you?
I think at the heart of it, thank you for having me, by the way, and nice to see everyone here. I think at the heart of it is the fact that Indigenous people have been subjected to having their information taken from them and literally almost never having control of what happens to that information and who gets access to it. But now there's been a rise for the last decade, I would say, of sovereignty at all levels, including digital sovereignty. So it means the ownership and the access of information, digital information of Indigenous people for themselves. The basic concept of nothing about us without us is a huge reminder of what we should be thinking about when we think about Indigenous digital sovereignty.
And Alika, the same question to you. What does Indigenous digital sovereignty mean to you?
Yeah, so in my day job, I'm an anesthesiologist. And one of the things that you realize pretty quick as a doctor is there comes a point for all patients that they actually don't have any control, right? And so when I think about Indigenous data sovereignty, it's taking those situations where people don't have control because they don't control their data or other things and just magnifying it by 10 to 100 times. You know, when you have a patient who comes in who has a history of being mistreated by the hospital, you know, they don't know where their complaints have gone. You know, you have someone who's tried to explain the same situation over and over again to 20 different people because the first 19 couldn't help them with their problem. You know, data sovereignty to me means the ability to take information that's always been yours and use it to make your life better, to help solve your problems.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Jeff?
So I'm a software developer. I run an Indigenous tech company. And so when we think about Indigenous digital sovereignty, it includes things like connectivity and governance over data. And in particular, with the work that we do with Indigenous communities, you know, a lot has to do with you know, design over the data structures that are about Indigenous peoples, management of data, the governance of that data, and also where that data is stored and collected and housed. I think in this era of, you know, so-called cloud technologies, we have a lot of data flowing through you know, a lot of these systems. And when it comes to Indigenous data, we really like to think about the intersection of people and communities in data. And, you know, they say data is the new oil. And so when we think about extractive behaviors from colonial entities against Indigenous peoples, we also have to think about sovereignty over our digital footprint as well.
Exactly. Okay, and speaking of data extraction in Indigenous communities, we were talking a little bit backstage about how Indigenous peoples are one of the, if not the most tracked people. Alika, can you elaborate on that, please? And in terms of, you know, how it relates to everything online now.
Yeah, so I've been president of the Canadian Medical Association, National Voice of Canada's Physicians for the past year. Lots of conversations about data. Data comes up in every single conversation about making healthcare better. And I think when you look at what actually makes it better, it's putting your data in your hands for when you go into different places so people can see what they need to see to solve the problems that you come to them with, right? Like for me as an anesthesiologist, what are the things that I need to see when you come see me? Well, I need to know things about your heart, your lungs, you know, your other organ systems, so I can start to plan out how things should be done in your best interest. And I think what happens with Indigenous data is we collect a ton of it, but then it never goes to the right place. You know, there's reams and reams of data collected on First Nations people from the point that they're born to the point that they are in their lives, and that data doesn't inform better decisions. You know, and so I think when you look at these systems that we've designed, a lot of them are fragmented to benefit the organization, like the hospital or the clinic or the government or other things. They're not really centered around making sure that someone like Sheila can, you know, walk into my office and I can actually give you better care.
Right, right. And anyone else want to?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And at the same time, when we collect data, we think of also statistics. I know that a few years ago when I was working on the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and talking to police forces in Manitoba, including Winnipeg Police at the time and RCMP, they said about 12 years ago that we don't collect data because we treat everyone equally and everyone is important, just as equal. Kind of like when people say all lives matter, missing the point about that. But they gave us a list to look at of the names of people that were on this list that were missing or murdered. At the time, it was a short list. When they read each name, there was at least 90% of Indigenous names on there. And I pointed that out as a fact, and they said, well, we treat them all the same. But then, to me, it was ignoring the obvious that we're unfairly represented and targeted in this space, but also that represents all other spaces that Indigenous people are in. So while there's fake humility and fake respect that says we treat everyone the same, there is good reasons why we should keep statistics and data information about Indigenous people, because it's important to look forward into the future on making plans and making a better society and community for future generations, including my 3-year-old grandson. I don't want him to have the same hardships that we all have had over the last few decades and years to access anything. So if that could help, but also Indigenous people need to be part of the dissemination and processing of data and digital information about us. And we have to work through those trust issues. We have a lot of mistrust of government, including Stats Canada. I think there's a lot of us on reserves that will speak to Stats Canada at very minimal. We won't tell them the proper information because we're skeptical that they're going to take our information. But at the same time, it's happening already. When you think about also social media companies like Facebook. Facebook can probably have a good digital printout about what Indigenous people are thinking, seeing, feeling, eating, our cultures, everything probably can create a nice profile about us without even us knowing that that's possible. So I think it is important, and it has both negative opportunities and challenges.
Okay, so my next question I'm going to pose to you, Jeff, and of course I would like your input as well. We can't talk about Indigenous digital sovereignty without, touching on some Indigenous communities in Canada do not even have connectivity. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, that has to be fixed first. Everyone should be connected and have good connection.
Yeah, and we should also have water that we can drink, and
exactly.
If you look at what is prioritized as a basic human right, water seems to be like one of the number one things. And then if you extend that to other services that governments provide, connectivity was deemed a human right, but at what levels, at what speeds? Are out there, because it can unlock a lot of potential telehealth or other economic opportunities for remote communities, but you need to have that connectivity in the first place. And so we talk about this digital divide, and when the CRTC says that this is a human right, connectivity, well, guess which communities get left behind to the very end to get connected.
Well, what do we have to do to change that? What needs to happen? What do the leaders in Indigenous communities have to do to change this? And going to tech companies like you to ensure that these. I know it's not your personal job, but to ensure that everyone is connected.
Well, we need Indigenous people in decision-making positions around connectivity. There's First Nations Technology Council visitors here, for example, out of BC. A lot of amazing groups advocating and making sure that Indigenous voices are heard at these policy decision-making tables. And we're trying to do it from more of from a data perspective, in ensuring that Indigenous data sovereignty principles are woven into nothing about us without us, making sure that these principles are centered through an Indigenous worldview, so that we're not further extracted from or left behind.
And how do we protect our autonomy and and sovereignty within Indigenous digital world?
I think part of that, if I may, is political will. I think that has to be there as well, because we know that communities are ready and wanting to have access to digital means, and all reserves, all urban centers and rural centers want access. It's kind of like a basic human right almost these days to have access to the internet, and we saw the importance of it during the COVID pandemic, right? And how many people on reserves had less care or access to care because of the isolation. It got even worse. And so if we had better digital access, we would have had access to people like Dr. Alika Lafontaine on my reserve in Bunibonibee Cree Nation, north of Manitoba. But because that didn't happen, a lot of people got sicker and a lot of people died. And a lot of it has to do with political will. Our politicians, and having been an elected leader one time, know that to make big, bold statements, you need public support to be able to do that. So if the public is not involved, and if they're going to be complacent, so will the politicians and the leaders of our country and our nations. So this is good that we talk about this. It helps pressure the right people to actually do the work, because we already have experts like these folks and then the other from across Canada that have this technology expertise that we need.
Just to extend on that real quick, I think people sometimes forget rights aren't rights unless you can express them. Like, rights are just ideas until you actually exert your right. And I think when you look at exercise of rights by First Nations, Métis, or Inuit people, if they're not actually around tables exerting their nation rights, or they're not being able to use their digital information to provide them value, those rights don't really exist. And I think to everyone in the audience who's thinking about making an impact in this area, we don't have data. I think a lot of people assume we have these repositories that are locked away, that if only we could unlock that custodian, lock on there, suddenly everything would be better and everyone know these stories. We don't have these stories at all. In Manitoba, Marcia Anderson, who's an internal medicine doc at University of Manitoba, when COVID first hit, she actually went out into communities and collected information herself and worked with chiefs in communities and other members of communities to actually create a network where they could bring that information in. And then she took that information to the chief medical officer, and they met on a weekly basis to take information that just did not exist in these repositories, so then you can make different decisions. And so I think the reason why you're starting to see things change generally when it comes to equity, diversity, and inclusion across Canada, people are filling the spaces with their data. And what we used to think is that the only data that was trustworthy was if it was behind an organization that had a brand and had authority. It was from the federal government, or it was from the Canadian Medical Association, or other things. But what I think we've actually found is what matters is that data actually comes from the people.
Right. Well, and what also needs to change from a policy and government perspective in order to protect digital sovereignty of Indigenous communities?
Yeah, I would say that the realization that, one, the data that is most useful probably isn't thought of as useful at a policy level, right? When Sheila and I were working on the Indigenous Health Alliance together, we raised $70 million for Indigenous health transformation, led to a ton of things that transformed health. Yeah, mainly clap for Sheila.
Awesome. And Alika.
Yeah, that led to a bunch of transformation work. But what happened in the Alliance is you had leaders like Sheila speak with insiders like myself in the healthcare system, and we figured out a way to have that language translated over to the government. So when Indigenous Services Canada got reorganized, when Jane Philpott was health minister at the federal level, a lot of the things that Sheila and other political leaders were saying in the Alliance ended up getting integrated into that plan, because you were taking someone who was in a position of authority, saying the words and talking about the things that actually would move the needle when it came to quality improvement and safety and patient-centered care, et cetera. And I think that the challenge for data is infrastructure, obviously, but I think even more importantly, it's helping people understand how to communicate with each other, Because we have all these different fragmented systems where I have code language in the OR when it comes to talking about patients that patients just don't understand. But it's not that you can't understand the concepts, it's just I'm talking in code language.
Right. Well, and I mean, we can't always put everything on the government. How do we do it individually? And you know, we need to protect ourselves individually as well. So how do we do that in the Indigenous perspective?
Part of it is that we have to know what our rights are and exercise those rights. Your rights to your information and your data and your community's data and your family's data. So figure out what that is, but also be relentless in your efforts to make a change. And Alika talks about that time that we worked together on transformation. I was actually relentless. Every time I saw Jane Philpott in the airport, I would say, "Hey, Jane, how about that agreement?" And she probably got really annoyed with me, but I really had to go at every opportunity, say we need to make this change, because we had stats. We had reams of stats of off the page of how terrible a health condition that Manitoba, especially Northern Manitoba First Nations, were in. We had cancer rates. We had to extend pages on these PDFs and printouts, and Alika had lots of printouts as well of stats. Like, we literally had printouts. So we knew that they needed to make a change, but we also had to be relentless. We were really...
Jeff, can you add to that, please?
Well, you know, we're talking about Indigenous digital sovereignty. I think the word sovereignty is key there. Understanding that, and you know, what our rights are as Indigenous peoples and in communities, and claiming that sovereignty over, yes, including the data, and also acknowledging that you know, data will need to be collected, but how do we do this in a fair way, in an ethical way? There are frameworks out there for how this can be done, and a lot of groups that have to do research, or you know, part of their work is researching Indigenous peoples. Like, just want to acknowledge that this is standing room only here. People are coming to learn. This is an increasing, like, a need that people have.
That's great. Thank you all. To you all. Let's
there is a need. People are trying to figure this out. Okay, you know, maybe before data was just sort of scooped up and collected, but now people are understanding the sovereignty piece. And so we have a lot of allies and folks out in the community that are trying to do things the right way. And the thing is that there are frameworks, there are principles, and at the end of the day, you got to respect the sovereignty piece of it, both as a collective sovereignty around data and these kinds of things, but also at the individual level.
But we also have to be aware that, isn't it, you know, once you post something, it's out there, and it's out there, right? I mean, like, who owns the rights to our songs, stories that we've been putting on social media sites, because we want to share, and we want to share our histories and the truth, and so our kids and grandkids can know their truth.
Yeah. You know, I think you're going to see a transformation in social media from just kind of share things and hope that things will work out to now this fractional value exchange. Like, Twitter's going to start crypto payments. And I think one of the reasons they're doing that is to make sure that people who are parts of these social systems that are sharing things that people want to see, they get reimbursed. Because what does that system actually want? It wants you to spend more time on the system, but to generate types of value. And I think that it's a natural evolution of any economy, that once you start to build things, you start to focus on things that actually make a big difference, right? So I'm on TikTok lots, but it's mainly like learning education stuff, you know? And I think that if we lean into creating that when it comes to songs and culture and other things, like, how do you maintain that value? I think the other part is just recognizing that Indigenous philosophy is very different than Western philosophy when it comes to information. Western philosophy believes that all information should be freely accessible at any time. Indigenous philosophy requires you to be in a place at a time with the right person. And sometimes it's
orally, it's very oral, right?
Sometimes it's sitting there the entire day to hear a creation story over many days, right? And
protocol.
Yeah, it's protocol, and it's making sure that you respect the knowledge. And I think part of making sure that the wrong information doesn't get shared in the wrong ways, or the right information doesn't get shared in the wrong ways. Yeah, it's making sure that we teach our young people that this is, like, that information is not, its value is not in its free distribution. It's being shared in the proper way by the right protocol.
We do want to share our culture and stories and traditions in the appropriate way. And I'd be remiss not to mention the generative AI movement that's going on now. Like, you can go to these things and ask for, show me an Indigenous person in a headdress, and it creates an image from somewhere. It has some sort of training data in order, you can ask ChatGPT how to smudge and what are medicines, and it will come up with an answer. Now, whether or not those answers came from people or information that was technically freely accessible on the internet, but also potentially stolen data that was made on the internet and used as training data, but also incorrect information. If we have people who are pretending to be Indigenous peoples and putting up content and information, and then all of this AI consumes that data, and then, when somebody is asking about Indigenous culture, it spits out, some gobbledygook, like incorrect, very harmful information.
Also, speaking of AI, one thing I think is very important with our languages. I'm being Ojibwe. I know you're a fluent Cree speaker. That's so amazing. My mother is, but she's a residential school survivor. I'm still trying to learn my language, and I'm in my 40s. That's all I'm going to say about that. And so we have to use these platforms and maybe AI to revitalize the language, because our speakers are, they're dying, and it's not being passed on the way it should be. So
absolutely, cultural appropriation, the Asian culture, but it's the yin and the yang, right? It's the good and the bad. We have to be brave and embrace both, and teach our children through education on how to protect and use and share data and information about themselves, about their future, and also, use this as an opportunity, I think, to reclaim the culture that was lost. Murray Sinclair talked about how education got us into this trouble. Education can get us out of the trouble as well, and future generations have a lot of hope to be able to lead us the way on that.
Yeah.
Jeff, can you please add to that? And do you within your company have any language apps that or are you creating any? Can you talk about the importance of using digital platforms to save these dying languages?
Yeah, we've created apps and software for Indigenous languages, but we more lean on the knowledge keepers, the language keepers, to tell us how they want us to build the apps. There are some AI initiatives around language, and there's some really scary situations in the States where non-Indigenous people gathered language data and held on to that and was like holding it ransom. It was also for the purpose of creating language apps, kind of thing. So we want to not build apps that way. We want to build, lifting up the voices of these knowledge, these language keepers.
Can you explain holding it ransom? What do you mean by that?
Oh, you can Google the case, but yeah, like in order for AI, you need training data, you need info, and so if you need to hear many different recordings of all kinds of different voices saying all the same words, and so a lot of work needs to go into recording all of these things so that you can enter that. And so if you have, for example, bad actors on Indigenous folks, companies looking to, as an economic opportunity, to take that data to create these things. This is why it's important to have Indigenous people leading tech, and we have an Indigenous attendee program here at Collision where there's like well over 100 attendees that are, and we have a lot of Indigenous tech startups. So we have the tools, we have the skills, we have the people to lead and create tech that causes no harm to Indigenous peoples.
Okay, and Alika, your...
Yeah, nothing really add to those two things, but I think just generally whenever you're building tech, and to anyone who's building companies out here, there's like that delta where you like pull your sustainability model out of, right? And I think sometimes you extract value from the little value that remains in the community after the government and everyone else has extracted that value, right? And what I hope companies will do in the future is we repatriate value. Like go look at all these places that have exploited Indigenous communities, bring that value back into the community, and then find your delta there. I think if we do that, like communities will be much more sustainable. And I really think that that'll lead to a tech boom with Indigenous peoples, because communities are always afraid that this is just a repeat of what's came before.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just quickly, I just got the wrap sign. Can I just get a quick final thoughts from each of you, please?
Yeah, I guess I'll go first. So I think the solutions in tech always come down to people. So if your tech enables people to solve problems, your tech will be successful.
And going back to the basics, learn and understand and teach yourself and teach others about what's important to Indigenous people, understand the worldview, what's important to us. There's a lot of great books out there now that talk about what's important to us, and really that's people, our families, and the land and at the heart of it. So if you're starting out and setting forth, keep in mind what is important to Indigenous people and work from there.
From my perspective, I think we're still early in this digital era. In the grand scheme of things, especially with internet and what's been made possible there. And so for Indigenous peoples, it's still early. We have an opportunity to really lead. Like if you think on a seventh generation scale, it's really early, and we have a lot of young, bright Indigenous people getting into tech and leading. My nephew is here, sitting in the front row as a software developer, came to support his uncle. A lot of young, bright Indigenous people leading these movements, and that's what we need. This is about bringing Indigenous tech and worldview to the world here.
I'll add one thing too.
Yes.
Is our Indigenous humor and our laughter. We love it.
Right.
We try to use it everywhere. Like our merman in Manitoba, it's now gone global. So we know how to have fun.
Well, Alika, Sheila, and Jeff, it's a pleasure to to have you on this panel. And Collision, thank you, and thank you all for coming and taking the time to listen. We appreciate you all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.